The patriarch C.F. Seabrook was hailed as the Henry Ford of agriculture. His son, Jack, a keen businessman, was poised to take over what Life magazine called the biggest vegetable factory on earth. His son, John Seabrook, has written about his grandfather and father in his book called The Spinach King. It's subtitled The Rise and Fall of an American Dynasty. Work on The Spinach King started in the early 1980s when John Seabrook was with the New Yorker magazine. John Seabrook says, "I had a grandfather who was a champion of white supremacy, a true believer in the superiority of the Nordic Christian male."
Who first showed you the power of democracy? A teacher, mentor, or neighbor? Now you can honor your hero and support America 250, C-SPAN's 18-month ad-free celebration of 250 years of our nation's story. Give $25 or more by August 31st at cspan.org/donate and share your hero on our Democracy Hero Wall. We'll send you a Democracy Unfiltered decal as our thank you gift. Your support powers live reenactments, expert talks, and in-depth founder profiles, bringing history to life, unedited and ad-free. Join us in keeping America's story alive. Donate now at cspan.org/donate. That's cspan.org/donate. Thank you.
John Seabrook, at the end of your book, you write, "My life as a husband and a dad got immensely better after I stood up in a meeting and said out loud, 'Hi, I'm John, and I'm an alcoholic.'" When was that year?
You get right to it, Brian. That was 2016. So it was 9 years ago.
Why'd you do it?
You know, I had lost control of my drinking. And I don't know if it was because I had some sort of chemical imbalance or whether it just sort of sunk into a habit that I couldn't get out of. Uh, I think it was more the latter, but that doesn't mean that it was any easier. It was just, and it was interfering with my relationship with my wife and my kids, really. And well, as I say in the book, she gave me a credible ultimatum: either the booze or me. And so I chose her. Yeah.
How much drinking went on in your whole story with your family?
Alcohol was part of our family heritage, and it was also one of the ways my grandfather and my father used as sort of aspirational, sort of totemic aspects of the upper culture that they wanted to belong to. Clothes and alcohol were the two main sort of distinguishing features that my family, in their great hurry to sort of leapfrog the middle class and get to the upper class, embraced to a degree that almost seems absurd today. And it wasn't because they loved, drinking so much, at least not at first. It was more because the kind of people that they saw at the Racket and Tennis Club, or in my grandfather's case, the ocean liners that he took back and forth from Europe to New York in the first class salons, saw those folks ordering, and they saw their knowledge and realized that if they had that knowledge too, that they could pass for the people they wanted to be. So that was really, I think, the main reason why alcohol was so embraced by my family. But eventually, of course, with so much alcohol around, just the fact of the drinking kind of took over, I think.
I want to start with you before I get to your father and his father and his father and his father. Where,
Uh,
where do you live?
in Brooklyn.
What do you do?
I'm a staff writer at the New Yorker. I've been a staff writer at the New Yorker for more than 30 years now. So I write, long nonfiction pieces, sometimes short talk of the town pieces. It's kind of my day job. And then I write books from time to time.
How different are you from your father?
Uh, I think I'm as different as someone who is the son of a man who was very involved in his upbringing could be. My father kind of cast a spell over not just me and my siblings, but the whole household. He seemed to just be an absolute authority on whatever venture he chose to engage in, although he limited the ventures to things that he already had achieved mastery of. He wasn't someone who put himself in a situation where he wasn't already very knowledgeable. So we mentioned wine and clothes, but horses were a big part of his life. And the whole rigmarole around horses with the stables and the harness and the stable keepers and then he eventually got into four-in-hand driving, which is a spectacle that only few really indulge in America. All of that really made him a very powerful seeming figure to me, and yet I never really felt that I was him. I always felt my mother was really more of an influence on my work. She was a journalist. I became a journalist. She was kind of an outsider to this world who had only married my father a few years before. And so her perspective, even though it wasn't maybe the dominant perspective in the household, was certainly, I registered it. And I think I tended to gravitate that way. Not sure why, maybe just to sort of be my own person, but so, yeah, I'm not really very much like him, I think, in the end.
You quote your mother as saying in the book that you shouldn't be writing this stuff about your own family.
Yeah, my mother was very opposed to me writing about, my family or even anytime I used the first person in my New Yorker pieces, which I kinda made a habit. I sort of put myself in situations and kind of wrote about myself, using email or, so some of my early internet pieces were framed that way. But she, came from a tradition. She worked for the United Press for years, and she had been trained to like kind of leave herself out of the story. So on that level, she was opposed to it. And then, she had come into the Seabrook family right when it was just really getting bad, and then the last 3 years were her first 3 years in the family. So she got a front row view to just how nasty and dark some of this stuff was. And once it was ended, and once we'd left in '59, I think she wanted to really put it all behind her and didn't want to think about it and didn't want me thinking about it and kind of knew what if I kept at it I was going to uncover and really didn't want me to know about that. There's a lot of stuff that happened that I don't think my family really wanted me to know about, at least not until my father died and left me these papers.
When did you find out that your father had stood up at I think it was a family get together and admitted some of the things that the family had done? This was early in your book.
Well, my father was actually fairly circumspect about the things that had happened to him and his father. He rarely referred to it in my lifetime or in his lifetime, but when he died, he left me these boxes of papers that were basically legal documents that had been collected. My father was disowned by his father, as were his brothers, and after my grandfather died in 1964, there was a attempt to have the will declared invalid, and so there a lot of interviews were conducted with people around my grandfather in his later years, and those, even though the case was settled, those interviews, my father kept them, and even though he never spoke of them in his lifetime, he left me them when he died, and that was really the first I knew of how, difficult his relationship with his father had been and really how cruel his father had been and, emotionally abusive had been to him.
Your father died in 2009, and you have said that you found the box full of all the material that you used to write this book in that same year. Tell us where that happened, and did he tell you about it before he died, that the box was there for you?
No, he never mentioned box. My father was had a extensive filing system. He's very organized, and he had an executive secretary who helped him keep everything organized. And so he must have said to her, okay, these are the boxes that I want to save for my son. I mean, I had written about Seabrook Farms really 30 years ago. I first wrote about Seabrook Farms in the New Yorker while he was alive. And I had kind of interviewed him for that. And so he was well aware of my interest and in the family history. And he, unlike my mother, didn't discourage it. And it's interesting to speculate about why. I mean, I think partly because he liked the publicity. He'd always loved being written about in newspapers. I mean, my mother, he basically, I mean, their relationship began as a reporter and subject and eventually became man and wife. So he had a deep interest in favorable press coverage. Seabrook Farms had always used the family as the brand image, behind the Seabrook Farms brand. The fact that there was this real family of these sort of dynamic father and three sons, that was always promoted and used for editorial coverage, and it was their sort of special sauce. So he was well used to being written about. And I did, and so I wrote my piece 30 years ago. I really only had limited information, and the piece was, yeah, I would say more favorable to my grandfather than the book, because he hadn't shared the other stuff with me yet.
How much of a white supremacist was your father?
I would say my father was a white supremacist. I mean, first of all, the term wouldn't have been in use. When it was my grandfather was more. Again, he wouldn't maybe call himself that, but his attitudes were certainly sort of Jim Crow attitudes that in southern New Jersey, as I write about in the book, you go really far down in southern New Jersey and draw a line across the top of Maryland where the Mason-Dixon line ran. This part of New Jersey was under it. And it feels like you're in the South, not only culturally, but also geographically. It looks like the Mississippi River Delta because it's the Delaware River Delta. But, there's a similarity in the flatness of the land and the marshy creeks and the riparian borders. So it really felt like kind of the South. And then my grandfather's operation, although it was sort of promoted as a mechanical and technological farm, and it still required thousands of laborers who came from, many of them came from the Deep South, part of the Great Migration. And what they found in South Jersey really wasn't too different from what they left, unfortunately. And he ruled everything with a very autocratic iron fist. And yeah, his attitudes were what we would think of today as racist. And he also was completely against women being in the business at all, even though he had a daughter who went to business school and wanted to work with her brother, but wasn't allowed to because she was a woman. So yeah, he was a he was an old school guy that today certainly would be called a white supremacist.
How did you grow up in this family and listen through the years to their particular look at the news and the world around them, and then end up working for probably the most liberal publication in the United States for the last 30 years?
Well, I think class and way of our educational system plays a role in class in America. It's sort of the meritocracy of education and higher education. We're so-called meritocracy. Had a lot to do with it. I think it starts with the fact that my father and I are separated by almost 40 years. So there's almost two generations that occur between him and me. And that was also true of his father. There was 36 years between them. So uh, to his father, my father, who supported a union at Seabrook Farms and who also supported integrating the plant, was a wild-eyed, liberal, bleeding heart sort of figure that was severely criticized for those attitudes. Uh, I don't think I was far from my father as he was for his father, but and we both and unlike my grandfather was an uneducated man. My father was the first generation to go to college, and he went to Princeton. So then I followed him at Princeton, but by my time, it was sort of the I would s if we looking back today, I would say probably high point of American liberalism, and, Princeton University was where I mainlined those ideas and values, and then when I w as I was drawn to writing and literature, both fiction and nonfiction, I was immersed in sort of classic liberalism, and, I never really felt that my father was that conservative, but he did become he played the role as I became kind of more liberal, he seemed to sort of react by becoming more conservative, and so in the book, you see he sort of tries to provoke my liberal wife at the dinner table with various illiberal sallies. That kind of became his style. Maybe it was a way of sort of making some kind of peace in his mind with his father. I speculate about that in the book as well. But yeah, I don't think the differences were that great, but they were shaped by the times we grew up in, and our ages, our respective ages.
Do you have a family?
Yeah, I have 2 children. I have a 26-year-old son, named Harry, and I have a 16-year-old daughter named Rose, who I just dropped off at her summer job. And yeah, I have a wife, Lisa Reed, I've been married to for 30-some years.
And
We live in Brook
where are you today?
Today I'm in Vermont. I have this farm in Vermont that my family got in the 70s, and now I have, and it's like an old dairy farm. We don't have cows anymore, but we still have the barn and the land, and I'm sort of like the caretaker of the land. Basically, I do a lot of brush clearing and mowing and that sort of thing, which I find very restful, a great alternative to writing, kind of frees mind in a way, that allows you to then go back to work. It also connects me to my agricultural roots, which have never really left me, even though I hadn't lived in South Jersey for, since I was a teenager. But as I read about in the book, it kind of gets into your blood, the land and working with the land and just the nature of work on the land, and I just find that I love it.
How far was Seabrook Farms from Philadelphia?
Seabrook was 40 miles from Camden, and my grandfather, as the New Jersey Highway Commissioner in 1921, built a 4-lane concrete a road, the first paved road from Seabrook Farms to Camden with public funds. That was kind of his style. It was always Camden was where the vegetables would get by well, first by rail and then by road. Or New York was also within reach, or Newark, Jersey City was in reach in a day, and so the vegetables go to those ports, and then they get loaded across the river. Eventually, when they built Ben Franklin Bridge, they were driven across the river in 1926. Uh, but yeah, that was the market. The whole reason that Seabrook Farms was where it was because it was kind of in this sweet spot. It was about as far south as you could be, so you get advantage of the southern sort of climate, and get to New York and Philadelphia in a day. And the land was cheap enough to make it economical. In fact, New Jersey in the 19th century had so many of these so-called market gardens that the state was called the Garden State, and that's what my grandfather's father did. He was a market gardener, had a small, vegetable farm, and grew this sort of. It was called truck farm in those days. not because they had trucks, because there weren't any trucks yet, but it was the more archaic meaning of the word truck as produce or exchange, like I have no truck with you. And so these farmers were called truck farmers, and they were all southern Jersey is also very fertile. It still is. They have this mineral that locally is called marl, that they dig out of pits. There's a town called Marlton, which is, named for that stuff, and it's called glauconite, its actual name, and it's very rich in, phosphorus and other minerals, and the farmers spread it on the fields, and so they could grow 2, 3, sometimes even 4 crops, a year on the same land, and so they would intercrop, so they would have, spinach growing and strawberry growing in between the rows. Then the reason my family got their start at all was because in the early 20th century, there was no irrigation in southern New Jersey, incredibly. There was no way to irrigate your crops, and they were first to bring overhead irrigation, which was only viable because of the internal combustion engines and the electric motors that were then available for the first time to drive the water up to water tower. The Seabrooks were very involved with irrigation, and then it was frozen food, that technology in the later 20s that really put them on the map industrially.
At its peak, how big was the spinach farm?
So Seabrook Farms at its peak, and it was, they grew probably 30 crops in the course of a year, and it was all timed meticulously, so each would ripen after the other, so they could move the labor force from one to the next. And that was all designed according to the system of growth units that a climatologist came, and they actually had these slide rules that they gave to the farmers that they would use to calculate exactly when to plant and when the harvest would be. So at their peak, they had 25,000 acres of their own. My grandfather really owned it, and he also owned all the housing that workers lived in, which was the town of Seabrook, which was essentially kind of a Pullman town. And then they had another 25,000 acres of contract farming. So at their peak, they froze a third of all the nation's frozen vegetables. Getting my cat out of the way here, and they employed about 8,000 workers. That would have been in the mid 1950s, and the brand was Seabrook Farms, nationally known. They introduced the Mylar boil in the bag pouch, the first to have that in 1956, and that allowed them to make prepared foods or vegetables and sauces. So their frozen cream spinach, which eventually became their most popular and still is out and available, although there's no company behind it like Seabrook Farms anymore. That allowed them to get into those things. So yeah, then the advertising was all wrapped around sort of modernity, and the modern housewife not have to do any drudgery, to pop the bag in the boiling water, and then you're off to the opera or whatever you're heading out for. And in fact, in the film 2001, Stanley Kubrick film, which was made in mid-60s, uh, when the astronauts are transiting to the moon, if you stop the film, you can see that they're squeezing this stuff out of these kind of little liquefied packets, and the brand says Seabrook Farms. So I guess Stanley Kubrick associates Seabrook Farms with sort of modern and maybe sort of soulless food. But I think the company was probably happy with that brand placement.
What's the story of how your grandfather sold the company out from under his own sons?
So as my grandfather was born in 1881, so by the Second World War he was in his 60s, and he apparently had some kind of a medical event. It's a little unclear what it was. My father always said he had a stroke, and he never really recovered his strength after that, and my father really sort of took over during the war and then after the war, and so this sort of succession battle started to kind of take shape, and the way it played out was that, yeah, as the company expanded and borrowed money, and investment bankers would get a chance to sit on the board and have a say in company affairs. And for my grandfather, who, as I said, was a non-educated man who in no way identified with kind of Ivy League America, these investment bankers were, the kind of people that looked down on him, as he saw. For my father, they were really his peers that he had gone to college with. So there was a tension there, and as my grandfather's behavior became increasingly erratic, the investment bankers on the board would say to my father, "Look, we've got to get him off." He was still the chairman, the CEO. We need you to be in charge because we can't really work with him. And so that kind of built and built, and then finally the banker said to him, "The only way this is going to work is either you have him committed and removed, sort of legally from control of the company, or we will call our loans and bankrupt the company, and there won't be any more company." So my father was kind of faced with this sort of awful choice, and he chose to save the company. He and his brothers took the father to a hospital in Philadelphia, basically left him there, and he was confined there for about a month, and in an absolute rage. And he's talked to newspapers. It became kind of a big story in Philadelphia. And eventually, a judge ordered his release. And on that, he sold the company and disowned his sons as payback for having him, trying to have him committed. And that all went down in 1959, which is the year I was born.
Why did why did his daughter, was she the only one that got money out of the deal?
Yeah, so Thelma, although, as I said, was never allowed to work in the company, was kind of his caretaker when he got ill, and they had a apartment in Florida, and she would go down there and stay with him, and so she actually had a relationship with him that the boys were more kind of competitive with him. And then when it all went south and the boys tried to have their father committed, their lawyer told them that the only way this will ever really fly is if all four of you are, the three sons and the daughter are unified, and your mother are unified together in this. And Thelma eventually decided that she couldn't join her brothers, and so she opposed her brothers in this action to have their father committed. And eventually, he rewarded her by leaving her. Really, she was the only one that got money from him. I think she did very well, and that really was the final straw as far as her brothers and their relationship with her was concerned, and they never really spoke again. She and her kids and family, I never saw them or interacted with them in any way. They were out of the family and not really spoken of by my father.
What was the last year that the Seabrook family had anything to do with Seabrook Farms?
Well, there's a kind of there's two answers to that. I mean, the classical Seabrook Farms, which is one we're talking about, one that my grandfather and my father and brothers worked for, that was sold in 1959 to a New York wholesaler, and then that they were sold again to Springs Mills, which was a Southern textile company who wanted to diversify, and neither owner really understood the farming business or the frozen food part of it. And so the company basically kind of limped along for another 15 years. It was a major employer in the area, so it wasn't just about my family. But eventually the owners closed it down in 1975. And then in the 80s, the buildings were all torn down to save on the taxes, and the land was given to the Upper Deerfield Township, and the only thing that really remained of that company was the museum that the Japanese Americans who came to the company during World War II from the internment camps, and then the Estonians who came after the war from the displaced persons camps, they created a museum that basically kind of honored my grandfather as their sort of savior during this time. And that museum exists to this day. But meanwhile, in the 80s, my oldest uncle, the first of the sons, he had three sons, they started another frozen food, vegetable packing business called Seabrook Brothers Sons, which is just a couple miles away from where the old company was located. And even though they don't own the land, so it's not the kind of vertically integrated, and they don't own the housing or anything like that, but they do pack a lot of the local farmers' spinach and beans and peas, and and they also pack that Seabrook Farms branded frozen cream spinach, which they bought the brand of. So the family is kind of, and that now their sons run it. So the family is still in the frozen food business down there, although it's a sort of a little bit of a pale shadow of what the old company was.
Page 281, you say you ask your father about CL, who was his father. And then
CF.
but you ask him, was the old man a demagogue, a classic strong man with personality cult, who, like all dictators, clung to power even though it meant tearing apart his own family? Was he a sociopath, a malignant narcissist who could not tolerate anyone having power over him? Was he driven mad by the guilt of cheating his father and the fear his sons would do the same thing to him? Did the 1941 stroke and the pills he abused in his recovery from that murky event explain his behavior? I know you've got answers to all this, I assume by now, but who did you make mad with this book in your family?
Well, that's still playing out. We're gonna see. My siblings, I have two siblings. I have two surviving siblings. My father had two daughters with his first wife when he was young. Then he had a period of bachelordom, and then he married my mother some years later. So and he had two children, two boys with my mother. So there's two sets of us that are separated by a significant amount of years. So my oldest sister is 83 years old. She lives in New York City. She's a lawyer. She's really the one who is probably most like our father. Her mind is like his. She's a brilliant kind of legal mind, and she's great with finance too. I think she would certainly write a very different book about our father, and it would probably have fewer of the warts that I included. But she has not been so angry that she didn't reach out to me and basically say that I don't really agree with some of your interpretations, but our relationship is more important to me at this stage in our lives than whatever those disagreements are. So we're just gonna let that go. And then my brother, I think, is basically taking the same attitude. It's kind of the WASP way. You just kind of don't say that much about it, brush it under the rug. I think that the folks down in South Jersey who are still in the business are probably fairly unhappy I'm going down there, the Oban Festival, which is the, yearly event in the Buddhist calendar that down in Seabrook is a reunion of Seabrookers who come from a lot of the Japanese American folks, uh, well, parents are all gone, but people who came to Seabrook as children from the internment camps, and as children actually had a very positive experience because even though for the parents, the work was very difficult and they were often unhappy, for the children, it was kind of a great big summer camp with all it was also a very sort of multicultural, sort of ideal childhood. So a lot of them have very sort of fond childhood memories, nostalgic memories of Seabrook, and so they come back for reunions each year. And so I'm speaking at that event this year. And I think it's interesting because actually that's where the book starts. For my father went to that event in 1994 and was asked to speak about his father and couldn't do it. And I was sort of curious about why, and that was really how everything starts in the book. Now I'm, returning to that event, and maybe I can answer some of the questions that my father couldn't answer about his
You,
father.
you quote your father in the book as saying at most family parties there was tension because CF, who was his father, your grandfather, would be sarcastically critical of some family members. A daughter in law who was hard of hearing, or a preteen grandson who happened to be overweight. CF was in the habit of mocking May, Courtney's wife, who was embarrassed by a hearing loss and didn't wear a hearing aid. On social occasions, CF would speak softly and then enjoy watching May's discomfort, proving her vanity. This casual cruelty made the command performance events like the holiday gatherings at CF's nerve-wracking. I could go on, but you're getting to the point there. How angry are you about your grandfather?
Well, I'll first say about that passage you read. I think what was really going on there is that when the family became a brand, which was in 1945, and this whole brand story about the sort of American family behind the brand was built up, there came a point in which the real family couldn't measure up to the brand family, because the real family weren't perfect. And, for the reasons that you read in that passage, CF was extremely critical, and I think that was the main driver there, is that there was this mythologized ideal family, which still exists in the museum, by the way, that didn't really match reality. As far as how angry am I at my grandfather? Well, I must say that when my father left me these boxes and I read in great detail just how abusive my grandfather had been to my father, and really it was beyond anything I could have imagined. They even had a woman that my father had a relationship with Ava Gabor, of all people, in the early 50s, who was, of course, the one of three Gabor sisters. The Jaja was another one, and in fact, 10 years later, Ava Gabor played the role of a sophisticated New York woman who lives on a farm in Green Acres, a role that she actually lived 10 years before with my father when she would come down to Seabrook Farms on weekends and have these weekends in the country, and she even got involved in some product promotion. But my grandfather formed a fixation on Ava Gabor too, and basically pursued her. And of course, she was horrified and threw him out when he came to her apartment. But he then turned on my father and accused him of being a playboy and of bringing shame onto the family. All of this in a board meeting in public, and demanded his resignation on the spot. So just completely humiliated him. And his sin was that, his girlfriend didn't accept his advances. So that stuff did make me very angry, Ryan. And as I was writing the book, I was motivated in part just by a feeling of revenge and also a feeling that this is what my father, I mean, leaving me these papers and knowing that I'm a journalist, surely he knew what I would do with them. And so I thought, well, maybe, am I this sort of instrument of my father's revenge against his father that took kind of like 50 years to play out? But I have to say that as I was writing the book, you're always looking for kind of motivation to sort of get at it and get your juices going, and anger, and a sense that I was this sort of avenging, spirit, was a strong motivator for me in writing the book, yeah.
How much did you benefit in your life from the money that either your grandfather made or your father made?
My grandfather never left us. There was after the lawsuit. As I said, my father tried to have the his will thrown out because in the original will, none of us got anything. In a settlement that they negotiated before they went to trial, there was a trust set up for his grandchildren. He had, I think, 13 grandchildren, a modest trust from which I would get maybe $5,000 a year. So it was really not much to live on. My father, after Seabrook Farms, after he was dismissed and he was in his early 40s, went on to a much more lucrative career in Philadelphia, where he had a lot of business contacts from his work at Seabrook Farms, quickly found his feet. He ended up running a public corporation called International Utilities. He did very well there. And then when he went toward the end of his life, he had about 2,000 acres of land, and New Jersey offered to buy the development rights it was I think it was $15 million in the sort of 2007 era. And so that money ended up sort of passing along to us. He set up trusts for us, trust for our grandchildren. It's not enough to live on, but it certainly, I mean, it helps subsidize my writing career for sure.
Years ago, in the early 80s, a fellow used to appear on C-SPAN on our call-in show. His last name was Landauer, Jerry
Oh,
Landauer,
oh, wow.
Wall Street Journal reporter. And I must say,
Yeah.
when I read his name in your book, it's the first time I thought about him in years. His son is still around as a journalist, but why did he end up? Why did he end up in your book?
Yeah, so my father, they said after Seabrook Farms, he had this career in Philadelphia. And I think partly because his father had disowned him and basically tried to crush him, he wanted to prove that his father had failed and that he was just as successful, and that there'd been no real sort of break at all. And so he um, relied on, well, at the time, not necessarily legal use of company funds to fund his lifestyle, as this four-in-hand coaching thing was a very expensive endeavor. And he claimed that it benefited the company when people saw him on the top of the carriage driving around Madison Square Garden at the old horse show. And so he would expense a lot of that to the company. But by the 70s, the mid 70s, that those kind of so-called corporate perks were no longer allowed, or the SEC was cracking down, and so uh, the SEC had started an investigation of his use of company funds, and Jerry Landauer, who, yeah, for sure, but had made his bones as a Wall Street Journal reporter in Maryland when he broke the Spiro Agnew corruption story. He had then come to New York and was kind of looking for another sort of, uh, figure of malfeasance to focus on, and decided that my father, and I think he had a tipster inside the SEC who fed him some info, decided to make my father a target. And so there was a series of front page Wall Street Journal articles written by Jerry Landauer about, some of it was well reported. A lot of it had some innuendo about, Jack Seabrook's lifestyle and how he possibly affords it. And it 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 then the SEC investigation picked up, and there were these Swiss bank accounts involved, and getting the Swiss bank accounts open became a whole separate. And so this went on for about 4 years, and our house, my father saw Jerry Landauer as sort of trying to not just attack him, but like sort of bring down the whole sort of lost lifestyle that he had sort of embraced, which was absurd. But I listened to a lot of that discourse as a young man, and yeah, it was a very traumatic period in our family's life.
Landauer died at age 49 in the early 80s of a heart attack. Was How did it end? How'd your father get
It
out of it?
ended. Well, I don't want to like this is a spoiler alert, maybe, but so yeah, there was this Swiss bank account that some of this money had supposedly been put in, and so eventually the US, the SEC and the Swiss government worked out this treaty whereby I think for really the very first time they were going to open someone's Swiss bank account, and it was my father's Swiss bank account, and so then they would be able to know whether the money was in there or not. And so they got the right to open it, and they did open it. And there was nothing in there, and so the investigation ended. But what the SEC didn't know was that he had two Swiss bank accounts, and there was a second one. We don't know what was in that, but we can surmise. And the documents to that were hidden in the wine cellar, which is part of the whole story.
Okay,
Yeah.
this is not hugely important, but you talk about your father's suits, the suits that he wore, and the contraption that he had in his closet.
Yeah.
Tell us that story and what happened when your father died, and you tried to get rid of the suits.
Yeah. So, yeah, as I said, my father was a real dresser. I think Esquire named him as one of the best dressed men in America in 1963. He was tall, unlike his father, was another point of contention, and slim, and he looked great in clothes, and had kind of a British, kind of aquiline features. And so he early on started having clothes made for him at Savile Row, and also by the Savile Row style tailors in Manhattan, and he had a closet with so many clothes in it that he had a dry cleaner's apparatus installed in the attic. So when you stood in front of the closet, it looked like just kind of a normal closet, except that there was this keypad, and then there was like a legend with like what clothes would be dialed up by pushing what numbers, and there was, it was all like categorized very meticulously by fabric and style and the check of the whether window pane or house tooth and you would just punch at the buttons and then you would hear this thing going round and round and the clothes would show up. But so anyway, yeah, this was a famous closet that I grew up with hearing. I mean, it was just the sight of it. It was you hear the thing, at all times as he was getting dressed. But yeah, so when he died, many of these suits were left hanging, and they went back really to the 30s. So there were all these different eras of suits, and I had originally thought that I would have no trouble, finding a home for them. That people would be eager for these suits, but in fact, they're these heavy wool English suits for one thing, so they're kind of made for houses with no central heating. And another was that by then the whole sort of world of brands, Italian brands, menswear brands, had become basically the dominant sort of marketing strategy for that level high-end clothes, and the home a handmade piece that featured this beautiful British wool, but didn't have a brand really associated with it. It just wasn't of interest. So I really couldn't find many people. I fortunately had a number of friends who were my size, who I gave several suits and shirts. He had also like many shirts too, and they still have them. I still have, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 of them in my closet or in my basement, but I can't fit them in my closet. The rest of them just kind of went there. I kind of advertised on Craigslist, and eventually this guy claimed to be a haberdasher, was going to sell them, came with a U-Haul truck and took everything. I actually think he just sort of took it as his wardrobe, and he wears it around. I keep hoping I'll bump into this guy one day on the streets of New York. But yeah, that's what happened to my father's
How
clothes.
tall was your dad, and how tall are you?
We're about the same size. I mean, I'm 6'3", he was 6'2", but we basically kind of had the same. Unfortunately, our shoe size is not exactly right. His was a half size too small. So all of those fantastic Belgian slippers and Edward Green leather shoes, I couldn't wear, that which killed me. But yeah.
How did Paul Manafort get into your book?
That's the craziest thing. So Seabrook, as I said, the Seabrook housing, which my grandfather owned, and rented to his workers. So he was their landlord as well as their employer. Um, After the company ended, it sort of stuck around, and eventually the government, was sort of not. It declined, and some of it probably was ready to get torn down. But the government, the health, the HUD stepped in and bought a significant number of the houses as Section 8, government funded housing. And Paul Manafort, who at that point was just sort of cutting his teeth as the Paul Manafort we know, heard that this was going to happen and that the government was going to spend all this money renovating these places. And so he bought shares in a company that the government hired to basically manage and renovate these properties, and he ended up getting these enormous tax credits really that he could sell, and the rent in a housing was jacked up 4 times above the market value because the government was paying, but the old Seabrookers who were still in that housing couldn't afford to the rent. So the people who the housing was really for were turned out of that housing, and Paul Manafort made hundreds of thousands of dollars. And it was later the was investigated, and there's transcripts available, and congressmen who were sitting in on the investigations. There was the worst example of corruption they'd seen in at least in public housing. So yeah, that's how Paul Manafort got involved.
As you know, Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey just went to prison. And
Yeah,
over the years, there haven't been that many people in the Senate who have gone to prison. However, you were an intern for one.
yeah, just my luck, right? Or maybe it's New Jersey.
Harrison
But
Williams,
yeah,
tell us
Senator,
that story.
I was there. Harrison Williams. Folks probably remember that Abscam scandal, which there was later a movie made about it. FBI agents dressed up as Arab sheiks in fawn, Bedouin clothing. and met with a number of New Jersey politicians, the mayor of Camden as being one of them, and one senator who was Senator Harrison Williams, who I had gotten a summer job. He was a ranking member on what was then called the Labor Committee, later the Human Resources Committee, and I worked for that committee. That the very summer that these meetings were going on, and yeah, Harrison Williams was caught on that, and they had him dead to rights, and he went to prison for a number of years, and that was the last time I believe a senator went to prison before Menendez started his term. And the fact they're both New Jersey politicians doesn't really speak that well for Jersey politics.
Why did you become a writer?
Honestly, I think the Seabrook Farm story was the first wanting to know what actually happened. This huge family explosion that occurred the year I was born that no one would talk about, and except for some of the sort of good parts of it, like, the parts that my grandfather was instrumental in frozen food and was the Henry Ford of agriculture, that stuff. But the real story, the even behind the scenes story, I was always curious about it. How my family got to America, that had been completely forgotten by the time I started looking into it, or willfully, I felt in the end forgotten by my grandfather because he wanted to have a lot more illustrious ancestors than he actually had. So I discovered a whole English family back, in England that I didn't even know existed, and met with a cousin of mine. And so I was always just kind of that person, the family historian, and I really didn't think I would be a writer as a teenager. I was, my my father and his brothers were all engineers. I ended up writing a lot about engineers, but I never actually became an engineer. But it wasn't until I got to college and sort of got exposed to, well, it was really the literature of fact, the course that John McPhee taught, yeah, and then on other semesters, other teachers would teach, and I ended up going back and teaching later. It was that course, which was kind of like how to write for the New Yorker, sort of, that really got me thinking that, literary skills, storytelling, character development could be used in nonfiction, and you could sort of, craft these kind of nonfiction narratives. It could be like novels. And my teacher actually was Jeffrey Wolf, who that year, who, when I took the course, who had just published his book, The Duke of Deception, which was about his father and ultimately the fraud that he had discovered that his father was. So I think a lot of it really goes back to that course, and then my just kind of like investigative impulses, and then my mother, having been a journalist, and hearing about her life as a reporter, was always very exciting to me.
You tell a story about your father moving to Aiken, South Carolina. Uh, uh, Before we go there, just a quickie. Did he run the cruise ship line, the Royal Caribbean? Your dad?
He didn't run it, but the company that he ran owned it. It was called Godis Larson, and then that company was spun off after he left. He was the main driver of that, and so although he never actually managed it or really did anything about the cruise line business, he did have this kind of corporate control for a time over it. And he was actually quite farsighted in seeing that cruise lines, which in the late 70s, early 80s, there was really nothing like the business today with these giant floating hotels. he was visionary in seeing that that business would take off, and he, was an early investor in it.
I'm sorry to interrupt what I was going to ask you earlier, but he moved to Aiken, South Carolina, and you tell the story
Yeah.
about when folks would come over to visit, the things that he would say that would upset your mother, and then when she died, they stopped coming to the house. Explain that.
Yeah, so South Carolina, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the sort of phony genealogy that my grandfather had constructed for us, and it involved the Seabrooks of South Carolina, who were early settlers in South Carolina, big slave owners on the coast. They had rice plantations on the coast. And so he was always kind of drawn to wanting to sort of, I think, live in South Carolina as though that was somehow the family seat. And but once he got there and kind of took on the persona of this kind of Southern gentleman. He would just basically always take the most conservative position. For example, the Confederate flag, as you know, used to fly over the State House in Columbia, South Carolina, and it was always a heated political issue in the early, 20th 21st century. Nikki Haley was on various sides of it. Anyway, he took a very strong position that the Confederate flag should remain flying over the State House, which was sort of absurd, I mean, it wasn't where he was really coming from, but and then he would just kind of like, take these sort of very controversially sort of racial positions and the sort of good old boys kind of egged him on and stuff. But I just found it. My mother found it very distasteful, and I think it turned out some of the people who were invited to the cocktail parties did too. But they had sort of held their tongue because they liked my mother, who was a very warm and gracious person. And then when she was gone, she died 4 years before he did. Um, they basically said, "Yeah, that's not why we were coming," and all of that was difficult for him. And yeah, well, like he never really let on, but it was difficult for us. Yeah,
Let me tell me where I'm wrong. Your grandfather's died in 1964 at 83 years old.
that's right.
Your father, Jack Seabrook, died in 2009 at 91 years old.
That's correct.
And you were born in 1959 and are 66 years old.
You got it.
A couple quickies because we're out of time. Who named it the Spinach King, your book?
I did, and I think I got from that Duke of Deception. Yeah, it was always in my mind, the Duke of Deception, and I don't know, when I hit on the Spinach King, it just seemed right to me, and I just that was the title of the article in the New Yorker in 1995, and I just always stayed with it.
And the other thing is there's a photograph, and our audience can't see this because this is an audio, but there's a photograph of your father sitting on top of the coach that you referred to earlier with a top hat and a couple of other people sitting with him. Explain, you don't have to go into this a lot, but what is coaching?
But it's coaching. It's not sitting on the sidelines and getting, young men to tackle. Although I spent my life trying to make that distinction. It's it's what Prince Philip used to do. It's what basically royal families do. The antique road coaches that people got from, they were sort of the original buses, basically. In England, they still call them coaches, and but they're buses now. But they would get you from London to Oxford to Brighton, and you would pay, and that's how you got there. And then they all were sort of superannuated when real buses came along. But my father began collecting them and restoring them, and then he got the horses and the harness there's a lot of know-how involved that he acquired, and he became a big, sort of mentor to others who wanted to get into it. And yeah, so that was coaching, and more specifically, four in hand coaching, which means you have four horses, and it's always in the left hand. So you have eight reins, which control four very powerful horses, all wrapped around the fingers of your left hand. And then in your right hand, you held the whip, and you have the top hat on. And in that picture on the cover of the Spinach King, that woman sitting next to him is would be my mother. That was her very first occasion that she had come down to visit him in South Jersey. She actually arrived as a colonist, thinking that she was going to get a colon out of this eccentric guy, and she didn't wear a hat. And her friends, there's two ladies on the back who kind of came as her chaperones, also hatless. And this was a horrible faux pas in the world of coaching, is that men and women always have to have hats. And so you see my father's expression on the cover of the book is pained. And I think that's because of the fact that my mother didn't have a hat on. So next time she came back, she definitely had a hat.
Anyone who's gotten interested from what they're hearing from you should know that there's a lot more in the book, certainly about your grandfather. We ended up talking more about your dad than your grandfather and his father, and on and on and on. But the name of the book is called The Spinach King, as we just said, The Rise and Fall of an American Dynasty. And our guest, New Yorker writer John Seabrook, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Ryan. It's been fun talking to you.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.